Okay, well, thank you very much for joining the NewMR webinar today, and I'm going to be talking to you all about the gargantuan differences between games and gamification for online research. It's really important for me to make it clear, though, this webinar really just scratches at the surface of the differences between games and gamification as two mediums, two methodologies, and as two industries, and of course how that in turn affects the application and results of market research. So I would really recommend that anyone interested in this area goes away and reads books like Glued to Games, The Art of Game Design, Gamification by Design, and also read any publications by the thought leaders in these industries, Sebastian Zetterding, James Newman, Ian Bogost, Rita Khaled, in order to find out more. You can also go to my PhD companion website, researchgames.org.uk, where I have a page with almost everything written so far about game-based research methods, and you can go on there to have a look at my development of a theoretical framework on how games and gamification for research impact participant engagement, emotion, and data quality. So why is it important that we do understand the differences between games and gamification for research? Well, first of all, that will help you identify which methodology would be the most effective for your project or your client's project, and it will help the research community develop processes and best practices pertaining to the needs of each methodology. And finally, each methodology will definitely drive different interactions with your participants, and in turn that will drive different research results affecting business decisions. But what happens if we don't understand and learn the differences? Well, first of all, what we will see is a continued mislabeling of games and gamification in market research, and that leads to a lot of miseducation and confusion. Mislabeling is already worryingly frequent in published papers. You know, many a time I'll read a paper about gamified surveys and it will be referred to or labelled as a game in a chart or in page 3, and so that mislabeling leads to a lot of confusion, and that as well really impacts the learning of students, who are of course tomorrow's researchers. I do a lot of university guest lectures with students about game-based research methods, and very often part of my job is having to untangle some of the miseducation around games and gamification, make it clear that there's a difference. And finally, we are, as the researchers, really do have a responsibility to educate our clients in these methodologies, and if we can't educate our clients, then who will? And of course our clients really need to know not only that there is a difference between these methodologies, but of course what kind of research results can they expect. Now, the first difference between games and gamification is, of course, their definitions. Now, the term game is a widely contested term. There are, to date, over 10 definitions of the word game. And actually, just this week, a new paper came out called The Word Game, the Ontology of an Indefinable Object, in which the authors argue that you can't actually define the word game. However, as part of my PhD, I've spoken to some of the leading academics, experts, game designers in the games and gamification industries, and the common theme is that there is definitely a difference between games and gamification, but also that games only can exist when all of the components of a game work harmoniously together. And so one of the most interesting definitions I found from Sebastian Zetterding, who's one of the thought leaders in gamification and games industry, has said that no typical element, i.e. goals and rules, on its own constitutes a game. Only when these things are assembled do they constitute a game. So basically what that means is if you've got an activity and you've just applied rules to it, that doesn't make it a game. If you've got an activity and you've just applied a goal to it, that doesn't make it a game. Game elements and game mechanics have to work together harmoniously in order to produce a game. And if you're not quite sure what game mechanics and game elements are, then you're more than welcome to listen to one of my other webinars down with NewMR, in which I describe what those are in a little bit more detail. Gamification, on the other hand, again, a widely contested term, but the widely accepted definition is that gamification is the use of game mechanics and game elements in non-game contexts. So basically what that means is that gamification is repurposing games to gain the engagement that games can create for activities that aren't games. So that in itself shows you that there is a difference between gamification and games. That gamification takes the form, the framework of games and applies it to something else that isn't a game. Now, of course, the second difference, one of the most prominent differences, is in the design process, and not just outside of market research, but within market research. So if you go away and speak to a game designer, and go away and speak to a gamification designer and ask them about their design processes, they will be very, very different. And in the market research industry, we do undervalue the design of a game for research and a survey that has been gamified. And so my advice is don't undervalue the design. The design is really the spine in which your research rigor will rest on. And that's really going to drive a lot of the interaction and the engagement with your participants, and that will obviously affect the results. And so the design processes with games for research, or as I call them, research games, is really designing the game with the research from the outset. The game and the research are inseparable. They work harmoniously together. Whereas to date, surveys that have been gamified tend to have a very different design approach. Tends to be that the survey exists first, and then gamification is kind of added on as an additional layer, and it can be seen visually as well as a very separate part of the research process. So to date, the most typical ways in which researchers have gamified surveys is to reword the way that questions are asked and adding graphics to the survey that are often unrelated to the research content. So for example, in a survey about school for children, it might be that there's pictures about of bunny rabbits on the survey. Not only does this not pertain to the definition of gamification, but actually obviously there's problems inherent in just rewording a question and adding graphics. And actually there have been some papers that have emerged to say that the participants have not been sufficiently engaged, or they've been distracted by some of these graphics, and in some cases gamified surveys have fared the worst in comparison to other survey types. And the third difference between games and gamification is also in the engagement and the motivation. So extrinsic motivators are often inherent in gamification as well, which uses in the majority of cases external motivators like point systems and badges, very much adopting the do X, get Y, carrot and stick approach. And it's argued that gamification is really just a repackaged operant theory, which was offered by Skinner in 1937. It's argued that really gamification isn't anything new, and so for that reason it can never promise the intrinsic motivation and engagement that is produced by well-designed games. And for that reason, gamification in and outside of market research is argued to always just hit a glass ceiling in terms of engagement and of course in terms of fun as well. Games, on the other hand, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, if you play a game, you've got that whole mind and body intrinsic engagement. You have a psychophysiological response. Your heart will beat faster, you'll sit on the edge of your seat, your palms may sweat, and your whole body becomes immersed in the experience. And we have seen that kind of experiential immersiveness in research games, in research games that we have produced at RTG. But why is this even important? Well, with extrinsic motivators, they don't always work. And we know that as researchers, because if they did, then incentives would have worked all this time and we wouldn't have any issues with engagement. But if we're using game-based research as a solution to low engagement, then it's important to note that gamification, which uses a lot of extrinsic motivators, may not always work for you. And so through intrinsic engagement, not only can we really motivate the participants to take part, to complete right through to the end of the survey, but what we will see is that they can be more creative and collaborative and productive and innovative, and even doing lots of voluntary actions that they don't have to do. And again, we've seen this when we've made games for research, and we can see that the participants are intrinsically engaged, and we have many measures to see how they are engaged. And another difference between games and gamification is two very different and distinct interactions. We play games, we take part in gamified activities. And so just to give you an example, Weight Watchers is seen as gamification, many loyalty cards are seen as gamification, and of course when we pass over our Starbucks card to get stamped by the barista for an extra free coffee, do we feel like we're playing a game? Probably not. But when we are playing Monopoly, we are playing a game of snooker, we're playing Super Mario, that is a very different kind of interaction. And that's important because when we play, as adults and as well as children, we stimulate the mind, we boost creativity and collaboration, and we increase our abilities to problem solve. And that's really what a lot of researchers are looking for in participants. We want to see them being creative and help us develop new products and product names and help us develop new packaging and problem solve about issues with services. And we want their minds to be stimulated. We don't want them to be bored. So it's important to induce that sense of play through games. And the final difference is, of course, the data. So with all these differences in mind, the outcomes will be very, very different. Indeed, in case studies to date on gamified surveys alone, the results have been extremely conflicting, where some authors will say, yes, I've seen an increase in engagement using gamified surveys, while others will say, actually, there's been no difference, and then other researchers will say, actually, the engagement with the gamified survey was the lowest in comparison to other survey types. So even with gamification, how we design that will be different from researcher to researcher. How you listening would design a gamified survey might be different to the way I would approach it or the way Ray would approach it. And so it's important to really keep in mind that the data will be different. So some final words to wrap up this webinar. Stop mislabeling. If you're using a game, be loud and be proud and shout about it. And similarly with gamification, go away and study and learn the differences more and practice, design gamified surveys, design games for research, and understand that there is no single correct methodology. It's all about what's right for you and your participants in terms of the engagement, emotion, and data results that you want to see. Thank you very much for your time.